Go.
Okay, Sex Education in Public versus Private Schools by Katie Colby, Molly Thomas, DeeDee Cohen, Hallie Compton.
So what is sex education? The World Health Organization says comprehensive sexuality education, CSE, gives young people accurate, age-appropriate information about sexuality and their sexual and reproductive health, which is critical for their health and survival. This poses the question, do schools really teach students this in an adequate way? And how does it differ in public versus private schools?
So, a brief history of sex education. In the 1960s, it was a growing movement, and it was basically up to parents and community opinion. And school boards did not want to deal with the controversy and were in fear of backlash from the community. And in my article from the 1960s in the New York Times, they were talking about the generation gap that was being created because of sex education, talking about how many of the parents see the generation gap between students and children being widened by such courses. They are horrid by scary sources and whispers that circulate about alleged democracy and obstinacy being taught in the schools. And then they also were talking about how sex education would seize their children's mind, turning them away from the Judeo-Christian ethic, which was very common in the California San Gabriel Valley, which is where the article takes place.
So just a quick brief note on public versus private school education. Public schools typically teach sex ed based on state and local mandates, which can vary from comprehensive to abstinence only, while private schools usually shape the sex education that they give based on their religious beliefs of the school. The differences in the teachings can lead to a disconnect of knowledge for students based on the school that they attend.
Okay, bear with me. Okay, so I've read articles from the leadership in private versus public schools, and they talked mostly about how private schools kind of strayed more away from teaching sex education earlier on to students and how they taught it later into high school. And a lot of it talked about how private school education values more of or were more prevalent in homophobia and less equal rights for all genders. And the quote says, sex-related drugs, exploitedness, female self-image, homophobia, and sexism, preppies do not compare favorably with public schools. And this also went into like how their leadership in schools and private schools emphasized qualities that are enhancing competitiveness and organizational growth. And they said stifle creativity and morale, which are crucial in competitive environment. And they were saying this, comparing it to the leadership in public schools, where they thought that public schools were not leading their students to be more competitive and like get good jobs later in life, because they were focusing more on teaching them like more about the real world, about like sex, drugs, and all that kind of thing. But public schools say that the long-term societal impact over immediate performance outcomes is what they focus more on. And that's why they did teach things like sex education, which they proved to be more favorable because the students learned how to take care of themselves earlier on. And my experience when I went to public school I went for most of my life. I only went for 2 years to private school, but I learned starting in 5th grade, and I was just separated from boys and girls. And we were taught how like first our bodies worked and all that. And then later into high school, we were learned about all kinds like sex, drugs, and any other topic, including that. And I think that this helped me like be more experienced in life and know what was coming at me. And that made me more comfortable in the world. Whereas I saw that like my siblings in private school kind of just didn't have that same education, and they struggled a lot more in life. And why is this important? This information from my sources show how education in private versus public handle educations and organization, and this can lead to uneducated students who will figure things out for themselves.
Okay, so my findings in my article was it was a qualitative study in private secondary education in Spain, and it focused, and basically their findings was that they focus on biological facts such as anatomy and reproduction, They neglect the emotional, physiological, and social aspects that come with sex education that a lot of places don't talk about. And then schools and parents should work together, is their main findings. And then they also found that students want a comprehensive sex education that covers relationships, consent, sexual orientation, gender identity, and respect. This is so important because the same problems found in there are same problems that are found in the United States, and this shows that this is a worldwide pattern, not an isolated issue, and that comprehensive sex education is effective everywhere. And then a quote that I had from the article is, I think that was a student talking, saying, I think that there are also times when students don't feel confident, when teachers don't feel confident or don't see it as the most normal thing in the world. They talk to you about contraception or the morning after pill, but they don't feel comfortable talking about to us about it, which is very important because that also speaks to why teachers need to speak to that. Anyway, so then my experiences are, I went to a very large public school with a graduating class of 650 students, and sex education was talked about in the 5th grade, but we only watched a video and we were separated from the boys and girls, and there was no talk about anything but the anatomy, which is also what was in this. And then we were supposed to talk about it in our 8th grade year, but COVID happened and it never happened.
From the article I read, I found that only 17 states require sex education. With that being said, many students don't receive complete or accurate sex education. And the article describes what good sex education should look like, which is medically accurate, evidence-based, and inclusive. And with my experience, I went to a private elementary school and was taught about sex in 3rd grade, and they split the boys and girls up and had the science teacher who was a woman, and the girls and guys separated from each other, and the gym teacher who was a male talked to the boys. And then why this is so important is it talks about why young people need good sex education. And it shows that many schools don't teach enough accurate information. And it highlights that sex ed helps students stay safe, make healthy choices, and build good relationships.
Okay, so my findings were that from my articles were that sexual health stats show concern. The amount of teen pregnancies increase, as well as HIV diagnoses, and the amount of new STDs per year in adolescents. My article really touched on the difference between public and private teachings of sex education by saying that private schools mostly teach abstinence-only teachings and promote abstinence until marriage as the only acceptable option. It also prohibits or minimizes information about contraception, except to emphasize the failure rates. Comprehensive sex education as a whole, which is more of the public school route, teaches abstinence as safest, but also accurate information on contraception, condom use, STDs, pregnancy, and prevention. Private school students had higher sexual activity rates, and my article stated that this was probably due to the lack of knowledge that the private school students had been given during their sexual education. One quote from my article said, despite the enormous amount of faculty energy expended to prevent it, the sexual activity of the prep school student, which is the private school, both in amount and degree of sophistication, is significantly greater than is found in public school students. It also says that teens receiving the CSE, comprehensive sex education, had a lower risk of teen pregnancy by 50%. And the CSE teaching does not increase sexual activity or encourage earlier sex, but teens who receive CSE education are more likely to use contraception, seek testing or treatment for STDs, and understand the risks and practice safe sex rather than the private school students. Another stat was that compared to public school students, the private school students scored worse on a number of indicators related to sexual attitudes and social behaviors. This included sex-related drug use, exploitative behavior, negative female or self-image, and higher levels of sexism and homophobia. My personal experiences, I went to a public school for my entire life. I received my sex education in 5th grade, and the boys and girls were separated. Similar to DeeDee, the boys had a boy teacher, and then the girls had a girl teacher. And I honestly learned most of my sex education, I feel like, at home because I had 2 older siblings. And so they would kind of chat about it. And then in high school, we were required to get another sex education, but I actually took online health for 2 summers. So that was online, and it was not probably the same as it would have been in person. But this is important because sources contradict certain different stereotypes. And the use of statistics show the benefit of open sex education, which is often seen in public schools. And it also fosters a space for educators to realize the role that they play in sex education.
And then going forward, the earlier they know about it, the more comfortable they'll be. More open communication / making less taboo. Create a more welcoming environment, solidify expectations for teaching it in schools, and more inclusion.